Somewhere in the American Midwest, on a steel mill floor that appears in no account of the Pacific War, a press came down on a sheet of 10-gauge steel and stamped it full of holes. The sheet was 10 feet long and 15 inches wide. It weighed about 66 pounds. Rows of 3-inch holes ran down its length, and along its edges were hooks and slots so that one sheet locked into the next like a piece of a puzzle. A man could carry one. 2 men could carry several. Laid side by side and end to end over graded coral or packed sand, enough of them made a runway a fighter could take off from. They made about 2 million tons of it before the war ended. That figure is worth sitting with. 2 million tons of steel punched into portable runway at a point in the war when the Army's own planners reckoned the demand would swallow between 70 and 100,000 tons of sheet steel a month, close to a third of the nation's sheet capacity. Counted another way, that is enough steel to have built 600 Liberty ships. The country turned it into flooring for airplanes instead, on islands most Americans could not have found on a map, and spread the job across close to 30 plants to do it. The material was called Marston Mat, after a small town in North Carolina near where the Army first tested it in the autumn of 1941. Most of the men who laid it across the Pacific never knew there had been a Marston, or cared. A steel company engineer named Gerald Groylich had designed it with the Army Corps of Engineers, and its whole purpose was to solve one problem. An airplane needs a hard, flat surface. Building one the ordinary way, grading and paving, takes time and skilled men and heavy plant. The mat let crews skip most of that. Set on almost any level ground, coral for preference, it turned unskilled hands into runway builders in a matter of days. At that first test in Carolina, an engineer aviation regiment put down a 3,000-foot strip on open ground in 11 days. Under fire, in the years after, they would do it faster. The men who laid that steel, and the men on the other side who tried to keep pace with picks and shovels, are the whole of what follows. There is no moral waiting at the end. It is work, the kind that leaves nothing behind but a runway and a great many ruined backs. They came in 2 kinds. There were the Army's aviation engineers, and there were the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, whose name was just the initials C and B run together. The Navy had raised them in early 1942 because the old way of building overseas, hiring civilian contractors, made no sense once every beachhead was a potential battlefield. So the Navy, in its own phrase, decided to roll its own. The men who came were often older tradesmen, carpenters and equipment operators, and steel workers who knew a craft, sent to the worst ground on earth and told to build on it. What the letters and diaries from those units record, over and over, is not danger. It is exhaustion. A construction battalion's diary notes in passing that the unit had been lucky, losing a handful of men to enemy action, and then, in the same breath, that malaria had put down close to a third of its strength. The crew's book of another battalion, on a small island in the Solomons, called life in the bivouac a sterile existence. Sleep near impossible in the heat and the insects and the unbroken rain. The nights split by air raid sirens and the bark of the anti-aircraft guns. On a third island, a New Zealand officer watched the construction men rip out jungle with bulldozers and crush the local coral into a runway, working the clock around under floodlights. Floodlights meant working under lights any Japanese pilot overhead could see. They did it anyway. The strip was wanted, and the schedule did not bend, and the work was not always done behind the lines. During the landing on Treasury, a Seabee named Aurelio Tassone drove his bulldozer straight at a Japanese pillbox, dropped the blade, and buried it and its crew, and came away with a silver star. The motto the battalions had given themselves, "We build, we fight," was more than a slogan. The aviation engineers watched the Seabees with admiration and something more sour beneath it. The air officers alongside them could not help noticing that the Navy men had better equipment and more of it, better food, better quarters, and a great deal more publicity. The engineers, younger on average, told themselves the older men could not stand up to combat and to the round-the-clock strain the way they could. There is a small, real bitterness in that. The bitterness of men doing identical brutal work while one set gets the newsreels. It did not change what either of them built. What they built shows clearest at Guadalcanal, where the thing started for the Seabees. The airfield there, the one the Americans named Henderson Field, had been begun by the Japanese and left half-finished when the Marines landed in August 1942. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion came ashore behind the Marines and inherited a strip under near-daily bombing and periodic shelling from the sea. Their answer was method. They built repair stations along the runway, prepositioned trucks loaded with rock and gravel, and stacked replacement sections of mat at the edges. When the bombers turned for home, the crews ran onto the field, filled the craters, tore out the ruptured mat, dropped in new mat, and swept the strip clear of the jagged metal that could open a tire. The officer who ran that work, Commander Joseph Blunden, left the arithmetic of it. 100 men could repair a 500-pound bomb hit, mat and all, in about 40 minutes. 40 minutes after the blast, the strip showed no sign it had been touched. His worst moments, he said, were not the bombs that went off. They were the ones that did not. An unexploded bomb still tore up the mat when it landed, and it still had to come out by hand before anyone could fill the hole. The proud line in the record is that through all the shelling and bombing, Henderson Field was never down more than 4 hours, and in a pinch was always usable by fighters. By the time the Marine engineers took the field over that November, 3 more strips had gone in nearby to support it. One was a turf runway 4,600 feet long, cut and rolled and filled in 3 days, built with captured Japanese equipment. Hold on to that last detail. It points at the other side of the story. The heavy equipment that finished the first American airfield of the Pacific War was Japanese. The enemy's own crews had left it on Guadalcanal, road rollers and trucks and generators when they fled the Marine landing. There is an old, much-repeated image of an enemy abandoning an airfield in perfect order, every machine intact, nothing destroyed. In this war, that story is true one time, and it runs backward from how it is usually told. The Japanese left Lunga Point in perfect order. The Americans inherited it and finished the job with the tools the enemy had walked away from. On the other side, there was nothing like it to abandon because Japan had never built the deep civil engineering base the American effort took for granted, the plants and the machines and the men trained to run them. The heavy tools were scarce. It had crushers and mixers and saws, but the bulldozers and power shovels that moved earth by the ton were never on hand in the numbers the work wanted, so the work fell to muscle instead, to picks and shovels and baskets and men and animals, from the first survey stake to the last load of fill. The construction units, the Setsueitai, were less military than civilian, mostly indentured laborers under a thin shell of engineers. And where the Americans landed a battalion with its own machines, the enemy landed a quota of men and told them to dig. They dug well for what they had. Munda is the proof of it. They wanted a strip there to shorten the reach toward Guadalcanal, and they knew that the moment American reconnaissance spotted a runway going in, the bombing would start. So they hid it. They strung cables between the crowns of the coconut palms and cut the trunks out from under them, so that from the air the canopy still read as unbroken plantation, while a runway took shape beneath. The trick held until the field was close to 90% done. When American planes caught it and began working it over, the laborers repaired the craters by hand, night after night, kept building, and had the strip operational by Christmas of 1942. It was a real feat of concealment and endurance. It bought them a field battered near to useless within weeks of the first planes landing on it. Here is the disparity with the drama taken out. Allied intelligence reckoned a Marston Mat runway could be repaired after a bomb hit in about 40 minutes, and that enemy crews at their forward fields needed something closer to 3 hours to make repairs that came out worse. One motorized carryall could move as much earth in a day as 180 men with hand tools. That was the whole game, in one number. Take Munda again, from the other end. When the Americans fought their way onto that field in the summer of 1943, the Seabees who came up behind the infantry did not repair the enemy's strip so much as erase it and begin over. Power shovels tore coral out of a hill at the end of the runway. Bulldozers and graders and rollers spread it and packed it, and with good coral everywhere and men and machines to spare, the work moved on its own weight. The strip the enemy had spent a month hiding and hand-mending became, inside a few days, something the enemy could not have built at all. The same pattern ran up every chain of islands, and the figures it threw off are almost tedious in their sameness. On Adak, in the Aleutians, bulldozers scraped sand across a tidal swamp, pierced planking went down on top, and 4 days after the landing, a 3,000-foot runway was in operation over ground that had been bog. On Saipan, the Seabees went at the main enemy airfield the same day the Marines took it, pausing to beat off counterattacks, and had it flying planes within 4 days. When the aviation engineers on Saipan wanted asphalt, which the highway textbooks called wrong for the tropics, they shipped in drums of the hardened stuff, melted it in a plant improvised from an abandoned sugar boiler, and poured out 700 tons of it over a coral base. On Tinian, where the beaches were walled with low coral cliffs, the Seabees rigged movable ramps to get ashore at all, then drove their bulldozers straight onto the enemy's half-built strip while the fighting still ran. On Iwo Jima, a construction battalion came ashore 20 minutes behind the first assault wave and went at the island's central airfield under artillery and sniper fire. It paid for the ground. That one battalion took 328 casualties, 42 of them dead. The heaviest loss any construction battalion suffered in the war, and the strip was taking crippled bombers before the island was called secure. Far to the south, other Seabees and engineers were grinding the same work northward out of Australia, through New Guinea, and on toward the Philippines, field after field. What the engineers on the other side were up against in the end was not a better shovel, which they could have understood. It was an industrial system that had judged at the level of national steel production that turning a jungle clearing into an airbase in a week was worth a third of the country's sheet steel output. The men who studied both sides afterward were blunt about it. Japanese engineers never reached more than a fraction of what the Seabees could do, and the hard part was that their own commanders often failed to grasp the limit and ordered them to do the impossible regardless. Some of the gap was doctrine. Japanese aircraft were light, and the bearing strength of most tropical soil was enough to fly them off, so the pressure to build heavy all-weather fields never bit the way it did on the American side. The rest was that the machines did not exist to send. The men were sent instead, and the men on both sides were used up the same way. The American engineer with malaria in his blood, laying steel under lights that painted a target on him, and the enemy laborer filling a crater by hand in the dark at Munda were nearer to each other than either was to the officers counting runways. Neither set of men settled the thing. The steel did, and the machines, and the 2 million tons of punched plate. The endurance was real and it was enormous, and it did not in the end mean anything larger than itself. It got runways built, which was the one thing it was ever asked to do. The accounting, once it was added up, reads like a quartermaster's ledger. In the Pacific alone, counting the Aleutians, the Seabees built 111 major airstrips. They built 441 piers. They put up better than 2,000 ammunition magazines and a great deal else besides. Under all of it sat that 2 million tons of punched steel, most of it laid by hand, much of it laid twice where the first field was outgrown, some of it laid a third time. For decades after, the leftover mat turned up as fencing and roadbed on 3 continents, wherever an American base had stood, rusting in fields where the runways themselves were long gone. The men who studied Japan's defeat went looking for the decisive weapon and did not find one. There was no single machine. There was the difference between an army that built its airfields by the ton and an army that built them by hand, worked out across 1,000 miles of ocean until the arithmetic came due. The steel mat is one small piece of how that war was really won, and the rest of it turns up on this channel.